presentation, I'm also honored by the fact that I'm speaking at such a high forum. This is the first time I've given this presentation at such a high level. And yes, I have a passion for history, and Lou Liotti and I have discussed this a little bit. I come at history not as an historian interested in dates and names and places and battles, but in the forces that acted on society. I look at history the way an engineer does, and the forces and how the society reacted to those forces, how they changed, how they grew, and ultimately sometimes how they died. And so that's where I come from, my history background. Otherwise, I'm an aeronautical engineer. And I want to thank some people. I first off want to thank Lou Liotti, my classmate from the Academy, who invited me here, and Heather Purvis and Wendy Pajota, who did such a marvelous job on the logistics of this event. I had to do virtually nothing myself. And Jessica McFarland, who did such a beautiful job on the postcard. I don't know how she did it, but she very nicely captured the historical matrix of the actual events that bookend my fictional story. And these are the Gan expedition to Rome in 97 AD, and the first well-documented Roman mission to China in 166 AD. Parthia, which is modern Iran and Iraq, and China had come into contact beginning around 50 BC as China reopened the overland Silk Road. And through Parthia, China and Rome began to be aware of these mysterious empires on the other side of the world from each other. The Romans called the mysterious Chinese the Sinaeans, a version of their name for themselves, the Qin, or the Saracens, the Silk people. And China was the first to reach out to Rome, because late in the first century they launched the Gan expedition under Gan to reach Rome and find out what these mysterious people were all about. And that expedition set out overland on the Silk Road through Central Asia. And back then, Afghanistan was a center of high culture, Greek-speaking, and the nexus of Buddhist philosophy and Greek philosophy, factory of the 1,000 richest cities. But when they got to Parthia, Parthia did not want Rome to come in contact with China. Partly, literally, they feared an alliance between the two. And secondly, they made a lot of money off of the overland trade going to Rome, and they did not want the Romans getting around that. So when the Parthians got to the capital, near Baghdad, and they said, well, we're here, how do we get to Rome? And the Parthians said, well, it's really, really hard. You have to go south by sea, down the Persian Gulf, around the coast of Africa, back up the Red Sea, thousands of miles. It's really, really hard. And by most historical accounts, the expedition got partway down that way and got discouraged and came back. But the interesting thing is they did file a report which survived and is quoted in my book when one of the members of the expedition briefs the emperor that described Roman cities, Roman roads, talked about the integrity of the Roman people. So I took it to be that they actually did it, and if I'm wrong, call it artistic license, but that was my impetus for the return Roman mission to China. Now, such missions would need people who could speak both Latin and Chinese fluently. Where do you find such people 2,000 years ago? By some accounts, some of the soldiers, Roman soldiers that were captured at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, according to Professor Dubs, wound up in the little town of Lishan in Gansu province in 35 BC. And coincidentally, that is also where making wine from grape instead of rice originated in China, also in 35 BC. So while there is no archaeological evidence proving that the Romans actually got there, they certainly put on Roman legion parades today in their provincial capital, and the Chinese have actually made movies about this. So that's where I took my translator. So for 5 generations, they kept their language while growing more Chinese each generation in appearance. So that is Marcia Lucia, my heroine, and Marcus Lucius Quintus, her brother. And so, and this story was modeled on the Chinese mission of 166, which also went by sea, as did this one, but they put in at the port of Hanoi and continued overland to the capital Luoyang up on the Yellow River. Let's see if I can make this. Yeah. So the Roman maritime trade figured prominently in the Eagle and the Dragon as the Europa, Asia, and Africa battled pirates, storms, and problematic locals to reach China. This trade was enormous and enormously important to the Roman economy, and it's almost totally overlooked by modern historians. I would suspect most of you have never heard that the Romans had a presence in India, and they had a very large one. Not as a province, not as a military outpost, but as trading and but as a trading relationship. We'll present some of the modern references that went into ensuring my story actually captured this trade accurately, and these are available for your review, but they're not purchased back there with the other books. And you may purchase copies of my books and my wife's totally unrelated books back there, and please do so because my wife will be very touched, and they're very good books. And I'll tell you more about them if you come back, but I'm not going to tie the conversation up with hers. We're going to be following this agenda, and in Navy style, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I will tell you what I told you. We're going to talk about the history of Mediterranean sailors in the Indian Ocean, which goes back much further than you might think. We're going to talk about contemporary sources of the 1st century who talked about this trade, what sort of trade goods they exchanged, the ships they used, how they navigated across the open ocean, and the enormous impact of this trade on the Roman economy. And ultimately how this lucrative trade came to a virtual halt in the 3rd century. Well, in case you thought Vasco da Gama was the first to go around Africa, not. Herodotus's history documents Pharaoh Necho, who contracted a Phoenician crew to circumnavigate Africa clockwise, going down the Red Sea, around Africa, and coming back into the Straits of Gibraltar. The crew put in crops every autumn, which is spring south of the equator. Apparently they were unable to trade with locals and for supplies, and they rounded the Straits of Gibraltar after 2 years, and I'm sure they were extremely happy to get back to the Mediterranean. That had to have been a trip comparable to going to the moon or Mars back then. Hanno, the Carthaginian, was a famous navigator. Among his other exploits is he explored the western Atlantic, perhaps as far as the Sargasso Sea, And he attempted to go around the other direction, but he only got as far as the Cameroons before he ran out of supplies and turned around and came back. One of the most useful pieces of information on the Indian Ocean trade is a contemporary document called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, or Sailing Directions Around the Indian Ocean. I find it interesting that this was written by an anonymous trader on a papyrus scroll 2,000 years ago in Greek, Koine Greek, and today this has been translated into a couple of dozen languages that didn't exist in his day and whipped around the world in the internet. I'm sure he would be impressed with what happened to his little set of useful information for traders. The Periplus starts with the main points of debarkation at Myos Hormos and Berenike, both in Egypt on the Red Sea. These were connected by road to the Nile at Thebes, and then by Nile to the Mediterranean. And he documented the ports going south along the coast of Africa, what they called the far side of Africa, as far south as Zania, opposite Madagascar. And they, like the Phoenicians before them, knew that the unexplored ocean continued and turned west to join the great ocean, which was the Atlantic. So they knew they could get around Africa, they just weren't sure there was a good reason to do it. They documented more ports going up the coast of Arabia and down the coast of India. The main port jumping off point for the Indian Ocean trade was Udam in Arabia, which is modern-day Aden in Yemen. And that was their last port of call, a good spot to pick up some water before heading out over the open ocean. This trade was born by a monsoonal wind that blew from the southwest from June to September, and then from the northeast from November to about February, and kicking up to about 40 knots. If you were at sea in a square rigger and that wind came up, you were probably going where that wind was going to take you, whether you wanted to or not. And this was called the Hippolytus wind, after the Greek explorer who found this about 100 BC. And the Periplus describes that if you keep the wind at your back, you're going to wind up in Scythia, which is modern-day Pakistan, or the port. That's me. Just a minute. Okay, got it back. Sorry. It would get you up here to modern-day Pakistan, or the port of modern-day port of Baruch, which was Garigasa back then. And there were dozens of ports going down the west coast of India, ending up at Maziris down at the tip, which was a major cosmopolitan city with Roman temples, a whole Roman district, sort of the equivalent of a consulate. 68,000 or 50,000 Jews moved there from Judea in 68 ahead of the Jewish rebellion. So a very cosmopolitan place in South India. I suspect that what they did is they would put in the north and then work their way down on each of these ports, shopping, and until they got to Maziris. And down at Maziris there was a large bay, and the ships would congregate there in the fall and wait for the wind to change to blow them home. Other contemporary sources were Strabo, writing in his geography in the early 1st century, and he noted that there were 122 ships every year departing for India. That's actually a lot of ships per month, considering that you only had 3 months to leave. And Pliny, in his natural histories, a couple of decades later, complained about 100 million sesterces going out to India in exchange for decadent luxury goods. And this is a good point to discuss how to convert Roman currency to dollars, since we didn't have a currency exchange. The Roman currency of the 1st century was very well disciplined and stable. The Indians were particularly intrigued with the fact that Roman coins, no matter whose picture was on them or what year they were minted, always weighed the same and were worth exactly the same. So they had a very consistent currency in the 1st century, and it was based on the gold aureus, which was set by law at 50 to the Roman pound. And by doing a little conversion and cranking in the cost of gold, you will find that that made the aureus worth about $350. The silver denarius was carefully adjusted with quantity of silver to make it worth 25 to the Roman aureus. And the dollar bill of the Roman Empire was the sestertius that Pliny referred to. This was a bronze coin with no intrinsic value because paper was way too expensive then to waste on money. And it was set by law at 100 to the aureus. So a sestertius was worth about $3.50, and this outgoing trade was $350 million. A lot of money. Let me see if this works. All of a sudden. There we go. So what did they trade? Well, going out, as I mentioned, was gold and silver. They were essentially exporting gold and silver because they actually had an abundance of this compared to India or China, and they just exported it in coinage. And they also exported wine because Mediterranean wine was very popular in the Far East, and Egyptian glassware. And the trade goods in were frankincense and myrrh, which were used in religious ceremonies, advantageous because it had a huge retail value per pound, so you could put it in small packages and easily tuck it into little spaces on your bulk cargo in the hold. They imported ivory and jewels, both set as artwork and as raw. They imported Indian spices, which worked their way down to the lower classes, and animals, as large as elephants, in the hold, coming back to the games in Rome, and unfortunately they were mostly killed. And the Romans used ivory so much that it was actually used as bumpers on workmen's ladders. They imported Chinese silk and iron. Silk was made into both men and women's clothes. Women's clothes were both very conservative stolas, or sometimes very daring diaphanous gowns that Pliny was complaining about. And men's togas made of silk were a lot more comfortable in the summer in Rome than a wool toga. And they imported tortoiseshell. Did I say tortoiseshell? Why would they want tortoiseshell? Well, it turns out the Romans they would cut it into fine strips, and they would make it into a laminate. And they would cover a tabletop with this very beautiful plastic-like laminate, waterproof, easily cleaned, stain-proof, 2,000 years ahead of Formica. And here are two tools. On the left is a Polynesian serving bowl, and the one in the center and the right are 17th and 18th century French tortoiseshell laminates. So what kind of ships made these trips? Beginning around 250 BC, Mediterranean trade began to expand, and when trade expands, so do the size of the ships. In 240 BC, Archimedes designed the largest sailing ship that we know of, the Syracusa, estimated to displace 1,900 tons with 3 masts. The working boat of the Mediterranean was a 2-master, perhaps 120 to 150 feet, with a displacement of 350 to 800 tons. But the Alexandrian grain freighters carried a stream of grain from Alexandria to Rome and other cities, and these ships, such as the Isis described by Lucian in 200 AD, were 180 by 45 feet in beam and maybe 1,200 tons displacement. Also 3-masters, the unsinkable 3-masters as they called them. St. Paul, when he was shipwrecked on Malta, as described in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 26, was on one of these Alexandrian grain freighters. They sailed on October the 22nd, which is late in the season for the Mediterranean because they closed down in November for storms. And he got caught in an early nor'easter. And his ship attempted to make harbor in Crete and was unsuccessful. And the ship was blown to Malta, and it took 2 weeks for him to get from Crete to Malta in a 60-mile-an-hour wind. Why? Basically, that ship did not want to run before the wind, because if it ran before a nor'easter, it would fetch up on the coast of Africa with a 60-knot wind at its back and no reverse gearing. And so they canted their bow to the north, taking the wind about 50 degrees on their bow, and essentially made about 1 knot speed of advance, tacking into that wind, going west of Malta, which is why it took 2 weeks. When they arrived in Malta, this must have been one tough ship, because when they arrived at Malta, they threw the anchor out over the stern to keep the bow downwind. They arrived at night, and in the morning, they chopped the anchor free, and the ship coasted under control to a controlled crash on the beach at St. Paul's Bay in Malta with no loss of life. All of these details are in the Acts of the Apostles. I actually read somebody who actually did almost an accident reconstruction on his shipwreck. So this is one of the smaller freighters, and the Europa, Asia, and Africa of my story would have been a little bit bigger with a 3rd mast, but this is the best depiction I could find. It's hard to get good depictions of Roman merchantmen, and the reason is that the only depictions we have of ships are on monuments. Now, the warships on monuments are depicted in exquisite detail because they're carrying out some kind of combat, and that is just very important to the image. On the other hand, the depictions of merchant ships, and you can see some of them on the references back there, The people are what is depicted in exquisite detail doing some heroic action on the ship, and they're usually depicted way out of proportion to the size of the ship, maybe a third the size of the mainmast. And the ship is almost a cartoon in the background. But this is a general reconstruction of what one of those ships might have looked like. It had a number of features that were different from 17th and 18th century ships, starting with the triangular topsail. It had a steeply raked foremast and a large Arcanon foresail. And over the next millennia, this foremast and foresail would decline to become the nearly horizontal bowsprit and the very small spritsail. And they would replace that position with a third mast here, and of course a foremast here, and the aftermast here with usually a gaff rig, serving as a trim tab that takes some of the stress off of the rudder when you're sailing into the wind. They got their name from the steep curve in the hull, the basket shape, and these were called corbita basket ships. Corbita being the word for basket. They had dual steering oars because the centerline rudder had not reached Europe, but these oars were linked together through some mechanical array, and there was quite a bit of mechanical advantage in this as well, because Lucian described what a light touch it took on the tiller to sail the ship. And one of the most interesting things they had that was lost to us are brails. Brails are lines running down the front of the sail, through the foot, back up to a pulley on the yard, and then back down to the deck. So they could lower the ship, shorten the sail by raising and lowering Venetian blinds. And they could even change the geometry of the sail by shortening one side and making it kind of a lateen rig, which might give them a little bit of an advantage when sailing close haul. So, but obviously with the number of sails that we have on our 19th century ship, this would be totally unworkable. So how did they navigate? Well, my background, I have several thousand of hours navigating EC-130s before GPS and INS. So I'm fully aware of the challenge of navigating, and there were a number of things that they did not have 2,000 years ago that made it more of a challenge. They did not have a compass, and they did not have an accurate clock that would have allowed them to compute longitude. We do know they sailed by stars, and for a very long time, because Homer, in the Odyssey, has the gods telling Odysseus to keep the bear on his right, in other words, to sail to the west. And they used the circumpolar stars for that. But it turns out the zodiac is an important part of their navigation. And the zodiac is not just some mythical constellations that is used to forecast your fortune. It is, first off, it's a calendar, because the sun is in one of these constellations, which are based around a simple story that all of these navigators had heard as children about people being raised into the sky, and it made these constellations easy to identify. And these constellations track out the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun across the sky over the course of the year. In the spring, it's on the celestial equator. In the summer, it's at 23 north. Again, back to the equator, and then in the winter at 23 south. And the signs of the zodiac are on that ecliptic. All of the planets also move on the ecliptic. The moon does not. The moon is a little bit above or below, and when it crosses the ecliptic, if it crosses in the same sign as the sun, same constellation as the sun, and it's new or full, you're going to have an eclipse. That's why it's called the ecliptic. This was how they predicted eclipses back then. The zodiac was also a clock, because at night you would watch this constellation rise. At midnight it would be over your head and then down. So a giant clock in the sky, so you knew when to call for the next watch. And the interesting thing is, it could have also have been used as a compass, because these are fixed stars with a fixed declination, and although they rise later every night, working their way around through the year, they always rise on the same latitude and always on the same compass heading for a given point. And it turns out this is basically about plus or minus 30 degrees. So that's quite a range of compass headings. And if you associate each compass heading with a particular destination, all you have to do is make sure that at sunset, a little after sunset, that constellation is rising on your bow. It's almost like taking evening stars. One of the most intriguing things from the ancient world was found by sponge divers off the island of Antikythera in Greece. It was a blob of residue that had been submerged in a Roman shipwreck bringing artwork back from Greece in 80 BC. And embedded in that were 47 precision gears of a technology that we did not know that the Greeks had. And it was comparable to the clockwork of the 16th century. What was it? It took a while. We began x-raying this in 1950 to try to figure out what it was. It turned out to have a readable brass engraved instruction manual on the front. And we were able to recover enough information from the gears to make reproductions such as this. And I watched this being made on YouTube with tools and technology of 2,000 years ago. That is, files. It was modular in construction. You had one big sun ring that handled it, and then you had gears for the moon, gears for the gears on the back. And how this worked, you had a crank on the side. As you turn that crank, these pointers all moved at different rates. The sun is there. And that would point to the sign of a zodiac, because they had each of the names of the month as the zodiac up there, and underneath that, tick marks for the day. So that set the month and the day. On the back, you had year pointers. You had two of them. The first was called the Metonic dial, which was a 19-year cycle, because the sun and the moon come back into alignment every 19 years. And so the second one was a 76-year, 4 multiple of the 19-year cycle. And that one was used to predict eclipses. And it was marked with eclipses, and you could predict an eclipse with this. Interestingly, the moon over here was marked as a half black, half white ball. And as the pointer rotated, the ball rotated on the shaft to indicate the phase of the moon. And the planets all moved. They used epicyclic gears to accommodate the retrograde motion of the planets, because as you turn this crank, for instance, Mars might go this way, then stop, then back up, and then continue on. So a very, very sophisticated piece of engineering, obviously not the first of the kind made. And if you're interested in seeing this, just look up Antikythera on YouTube and you will find an awful lot of interesting movies about this device and about the making of modern reproductions. And according to the person who made the reproduction, those 47 gears meshed so nicely that that thing just turned very, very, very smoothly, even though they were all made by hand filing the little triangular teeth. So what was it used for? Obviously, this is a useful astronomical device. The numerical system of the day did not lend itself, it was not fraction friendly. And you needed to do a lot of fractions in trigonometry to get these positions calculated. This did it automatically and error-free, at least to the extent that they had designed it. And it could have been a teaching aid. It was far too expensive and sophisticated to be used on a ship, and I don't know what they would use it for, but I could see it being used in port to plan a voyage. I talked about using the signs of the zodiac as compass points. But the signs of the zodiac are not terribly bright, and if it's a hazy night, you may not be able to see it. But Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus, if they're in that constellation, are very bright, and you can easily see them. So you could plan your voyage just by cranking in the dates you're departing and see where your planets are going to be and use them instead of the zodiac. That's pure speculation on my part. It's worthwhile looking at how other people navigated without sophisticated technology, and the Polynesians come immediately to mind. They were Stone Age people that navigated thousands of miles in the Pacific without a written language or any mathematics beyond counting, addition, and subtraction. So how did they do it? One of the things they did is they associated a star with a particular island. And so that star would be directly overhead that island. So if you aimed for that star, you were probably going to get to the island. In 1976, some people in Hawaii began the construction of Hakalea, which is a Polynesian ocean-going canoe. Ship, really, because she was 80 feet long, 60 tons, and a two-master. The catamarans on either side of her were hollowed out logs, and that's where the sleeping and storage quarters were. So she's a big ship, and they wanted to navigate her using the original techniques. And they found the only surviving navigator in the Pacific who knew the old school living in the Fiji Islands. And they brought him to Hawaii to train their crew. And this is documented in one of the big books you can look back there called Hawaii Key Rising by Sam Lowe. And he describes some of their navigational techniques. Obviously, stars with an island. And the Hakalea made her maiden voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti, a distance of 2,500 miles, and just off by 60 miles, not by nav error, but because they had been offset by adverse winds and currents en route, and they knew generally how much they were off. They were not foolish. They took a chase boat, but the chase boat could only take their information, could not give them any. And when they got down in close to destination, they used mental dead reckoning in terms of their dead reckoning, they were not allowed to take any notes. Whatever they remembered had to be memorized because the Polynesians had no written language. They would look at wave interference patterns, which would give them a clue as to where the island was. The clouds are another big giveaway in birds. One of the things that they did, at least in the northern Pacific, was to use the elevation of Polaris, and 2,000 years ago this would not have been Polaris, but a star in Draco, but still approximately close enough to the north. Basically, if you're at the pole, the North Star is directly overhead. If you're on the equator, it's skimming the horizon at 0 degrees, and if you're in somewhere in between, your latitude is basically the elevation of the pole star. And very easy calculation. You can also use the sun. Easier for the Europeans because they had the zodiac, so they knew the declination of the sun for a given month. And given that, your latitude is 90 degrees plus the declination minus the elevation. So in the Mediterranean, the sun is about 78 degrees on June 23rd, and that's about 35 north. The Polynesians had an interesting way of measuring elevation, and it was a hand sextant. And the navigator on the Hakulea set up a pole and calibrated it and walked off a certain distance and calibrated his sextant, so he knew 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees, and he could measure within plus or minus a couple of degrees very accurately. You will see this in the movie Moana by Walt Disney. And the reason you will see it is that the crew of Hakulea advised the filmmaker, and you will see them in the credits. And little Moana is taught how to use her hand sextant to figure out where she is. So it's both an amusing little cartoon movie and also an educational one. They had one other technique that I found really intriguing. I mentioned having a star that identifies a particular destination. If you have another star that is directly over that star, that defines a course line connecting you, your destination, and those two stars. And if you get off course to the north, the next night, this star is going to be off to the south. So this tells you how far to the right or left you need to correct your course to get back to going toward your destination. Interesting, simple technique. Amazing what people 2,000, 3,000 years ago did to get where they were going. And sometimes we don't give them credit for what they did. So, and finally there was one last thing, and that is how to calculate the navigational triangle. Hipparchus and Menelaus were the two Greek mathematicians who 25 years ago invented spherical trigonometry and developed the navigational triangle to solve all navigation problems. And the navigational triangle is made up of the pole, the co-latitude of one of the places you want to go, the co-latitude of the other, and the great circle line calculating it. Now, that's not hard to calculate when you've got a pocket calculator with sine and cosine functions on it. It's a little tedious, but it's not hard. However, the number system of that era had no zero, and just was not fraction friendly. And so this is a normally sphere. This is not just some decoration on Dumbledore's desk in Hogwarts. This is a very useful item. This is a toy, so it has two of the three things on it that make it important. The first thing it has is a sphere with latitude lines on it, and also on the sphere is the zodiac. So you know where the sun and the planets are given the month. What it needs is one other ring that will go around the equator and then come up to form a great circle line to connect any 2 points on the globe. And when you have done that, what you have got is a spherical slide rule that solves this. And if you want to know the distance to destination, you just read off the number of degrees indicated on that third ring. If you want to know how long daylight is going to last on a given day, you just crank in 5,400 miles to the latitude of the sun, and that is the time from sunrise to noon. You can do all of those, and just as easy to use as the old slide rule. This could have been used, again, for planning a voyage. I don't think they would have done that kind of detailed navigation while underway. And again, we don't know too much about what they did, because in the 16th century, navigation instructions to the Far East were very closely held secrets of each ship. Because guess what? The ship with the best navigation is going to be the ship that gets there first, and the ship that gets there first gets the most products and the best products. And so they had no interest in sharing the details of how they navigated. And so unfortunately, it leaves us having to do an awful lot of speculating. But I hope you found this interesting. As I said, I was a navigator, so it does show. So now I've talked about modern sources for shipbuilding, Lionel Casson, in particular on shipbuilding and seamanship. And I came to, now we're coming into the to the economics of this trade. My source is Raoul McLaughlin. Now I came to this with a great deal of trepidation. He's from Queen's University in Belfast. And I came into this with a great deal of trepidation because I had a very simplistic way of figuring out what my ship should carry. I took Strabo's 122 ships, and I divided that into the $350 million that Pliny said was going out every year, and I came up that basically these ships were carrying about $2 million in gold. And I figured he was going to blow me out of the water. Actually, he indicated I was a little on the low side. So he's written 4 books. The first is available. To you in the back. This one's on my Kindle because they wanted 3 figures for the paperback, and I wasn't going to pay it. And I haven't got the other 2. Raoul also has a lot of good presentations on YouTube, and they are very, very worth listening to. He talks extensively on this topic, and he has probably more detailed information than I've ever found on not just this trade, but the Roman economy in particular. So what went out, we've already talked about 100 million sesterces. McLaughlin reported that found in India was a hoard of 8,000 gold aurei weighing 160 pounds worth $2.8 billion from a single ship, probably shipwrecked. They put the stash away for safekeeping, and for whatever reason, never came back for it. That's from one single ship, 2.8. What came back? There is a document called the Muziris Periplus, which I looked up the other night, was actually an insurance document for the Homopolon, which was returning with $30 million in cargo. And that was an insurance document, because in Muziris, before she sailed to go back home, they were documenting her cargo in case she was shipwrecked or hijacked. Very modern piece of trade that we don't, again, associate too often. McLaughlin estimates the total volume back could have been as much as $10 billion a year. And this is where the Roman government got interested, because it's taxed. The import-export duty was called the Tatarte tax, which was set at 25%. And they taxed it twice. They taxed it exports going out, which included your gold and the silver, and then you taxed the imports coming back, which were now marked up from the wholesale Indian market to the retail Roman market. And so just some quick off the cuff calculations, that's roughly what they were getting for taxes there, almost $1 billion. And could you get around this? You could, but not easily. There was one Roman road that connected Berenike, Neos Homos, and the custom depot at Koptos near Thebes on the Nile. Now, if you wanted to bypass that, you could, but you'd have to set out through the desert. A lot of this cargo was kind of perishable, or silk might not stand up well to sand. Bandits could get you, and you had to have a certificate signed by the official at Koptos before your goods could be sold anywhere else. So they probably bribed the guy at Koptos, probably generously, to get him to understate how much this was worth. But it was probably cheaper to pay the tax than it was to try to get around it. There were a number of ways you could take that tax. Obviously, you could pay 25% in cash on the spot. You could also give them 25% of the goods and the government would sell them. Or you could leave them 25% in reserve as escrow and then come back and pay it off when you sold the rest of your product. So then your goods went up to Alexandria, and this is where more value was added, because silk was going to be dyed and woven into fabrics and turned into clothes. Jewels and ivory were going to be set into artwork, and various other things which were going to add still more value, and this was taxed at the more modest portaria, the 2.5% interprovincial sales tax. All told, they were getting over $1 billion in taxes per year off of that wasteful trade. And that made up about 1/3 of the Roman budget. Wow. And essentially, since half of the Roman budget was defense, it supported 2/3 of the legions. Raoul McLaughlin actually describes exactly how much it costs to keep a legion in the field. Very detailed set of books on that, the Roman economy. So this much money attracted a lot of pirates, such as one of my favorite characters in The Eagle and the Dragon, Ibrahim. These pirates were based on the uncontrolled eastern shore of the Red Sea. This part of Arabia was not under anybody's control at the time, just local kingdoms. And the pirates probably targeted down here at the mouth of the Red Sea, because it's narrow and it's easier to find your ships. If you're going to be stealing this quantity of cash, you have to be highly organized. You're not just going to put 160 pounds of gold in your backpack and set out across the desert. You're not going to get very far. And somebody's going to take it away from you, and you're not going to like what he does to you. They were probably actually financed by some of these kingdoms. Parthia may have been more than willing to finance pirates to take a little bit of money off of the Romans. Even bankers in Alexandria or other ship owners might be willing to ruin a competitor by having them hijacked. So these pirates were probably highly organized with intelligence, logistics set up to move the booty, and a place to go to get rid of it, and they might have to settle for actually just 10% of what they hauled after taking all the risk, but still 10% of $2 million was a healthy pay 2,000 years ago. The merchants defended themselves. Many of the ships, most of the ships, carried mercenary archers that could fight off the pirates. My ships I equipped with Army ballista crossbows with a range quarter to a half mile, firing 8-inch bolts similar to those that you see in the opening scene of Gladiator. And ships would have convoyed, I would expect they would have convoyed here in the high threat areas because there's always safety in number. And piracy became sufficient concern that the Romans set up a naval base here at the mouth of the Red Sea, probably near the Halak Island, to control piracy about 25 years after the setting of my book. So, what happened to this trade? Well, it turns out that the world of the 2nd century was probably more globalized than it was going to be for the next 1,500 years. And unfortunately, globalized trade brings with it globalized disease. And in 160 AD, in China, something that might have been smallpox broke out. And it wiped out 40,000 men in the Chinese Standing Army. This was more men than they had ever lost in combat. And it spread west to Europe along the Silk Road and along the sea routes. And when it got to Europe, it hit particularly miners and soldiers very hard and other people working in close proximity. The death rate may have been on the order of 30%. It disrupted international trade because these dynasties were all dealing with the same disease and they collapsed. So all of a sudden Rome had no trading partners. And I mentioned miners. Silver and gold mines were closing because of the death rate. So not only did Rome lose that tax revenue, but they began debasing their currency because they didn't have as much silver as they did before. And the denarius that was so nicely set at 25 to the aureus in 100 AD, by the 4th century was measured in the thousands. And this kicked off a hyperinflation. Throughout the 3rd century, there were 75 emperors in 100 years, so it was a very tumultuous time. While the population was shrinking, while the size of the army was shrinking, and Diocletian ultimately came in and imposed wage price controls in 300 AD. And he hired an army of what they called procuratores to supervise each business, regulate their quality, and ensure that they were complying with the official price guidelines. And we know how that sort of approach works. There was a burgeoning black market. And to pay for this army of procuratores and make up for the sales tax that they had had before, he imposed a head tax. And local officials, citizens, were actually getting flogged in the 4th century for not coming up with the requisite tax revenue from their district. Flogging a citizen would have been unheard of, the highest of all possible crimes in the 1st century. So here we are, at the end finally, and I see you're all still awake. I must have done something right. What I told you, the Indian Ocean trade was almost modern in scope. It was a major part of finance for a century. Collapsed to a Eurasian pandemic and dealt the Roman economy a body blow from which it never recovered, and Rome eventually collapsed in 450 BC, at least in part due to the things that were set in motion by that disease and the loss of that trade.